October 4th, 1943. Reich Air Ministry, Berlin. In an oak-walled chamber where decisions were meant to bend history, the room froze as Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring addressed a hand-picked circle of aircraft executives. Stenographers caught every syllable that evening, the same sentences that would age into one of the war's most ruinous misreads. The Americans, he insisted, could not build airplanes. Refrigerators, razor blades, certainly. War machines, impossible. Beyond the tall windows, plumes from overworked factories hovered above the city, a gray signature of a capital straining to refill the Luftwaffe's losses. Germany had been rocked at Stalingrad and in North Africa, yet the Reich still dominated most of Europe. Inside Göring's head, though, the United States stayed frozen in the 1920s, jazz clubs and department stores, not arsenals. What he could not see from that conference table was the scene unfolding across the Atlantic. American yards were already launching 3 Liberty ships every day. Before his session in Berlin wound down, Richmond would notch another hole completed. Within 6 months, the people Göring dismissed as appliance makers would fly 1,000-bomber missions against his cities, while shipyards rolled a new cargo vessel off the ways every 8 hours. The reckoning for the Reich was not being typed up in operations orders, but in ledgers, production numbers that quietly dismantled a fantasy at the core of Nazi strategy. Göring's certainty didn't spring from 1943 alone. It had roots in memory and pride. As a celebrated First World War ace with 22 victories, he remembered the United States arriving late and short on aircraft, borrowing British and French equipment. That snapshot hardened into a premise. America could sell consumer goods in bulk, but would falter at military manufacturing. They bluff, he liked to say when questioned about U.S. capacity. In 1940, with France on its knees, he told Hitler that Americans excelled at luxury cars and refrigerators, proof, he said, that they weren't serious builders of planes. The delusion had institutional backing. German intelligence echoed the line. In November 1941, Oskar Beppo Schmid, chief of Luftwaffe intelligence, filed a paper insisting U.S. aircraft output would top out at 400 planes a month. He argued American factories lacked the precision tools and disciplined labor pool high-end war production required. German naval analysts chimed in. In January 1942, a Kapitän zur See briefed Admiral Erich Raeder that U.S. shipyards could perhaps manage a cargo vessel per week, per yard, at best. Soft workers, he wrote, pampered by high wages and shorter shifts, could not match the rigor of German craftsmen. Hitler publicly sneered at American power. Yet in private, he told his generals in December 1941, crush Russia quickly, then turn to the United States before its output became unmanageable. Göring, tasked with weighing enemy air power, refused to budge. He kept repeating the myth while the United States did the opposite of what he predicted. America's transformation into Franklin Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy was not spontaneous. On January 6, 1942, in the State of the Union, FDR set audacious targets: 60,000 airplanes in 1942, ramping to 125,000 in 1943, 100,000 of them combat types. German intercept units heard the numbers. On January 8, 1942, Joseph Goebbels wrote that the Führer laughed at those goals. Propaganda, he scoffed. If they could build a 10th, it would be a miracle. But the groundwork had been pouring in since 1940, not from Washington's purse so much as from Britain's gold. The British Purchasing Commission begged for ships to replace tonnage being chewed up by U-boats and approached Henry J. Kaiser with a challenge: 60 cargo ships built with techniques never yet tried in shipbuilding. Kaiser had never built a ship. He had built the Hoover Dam ahead of schedule. He said yes, and changed wartime production. Kaiser stripped shipbuilding of the artisan pace. Prefabrication would replace on-slip improvisation. Welding, faster and lighter, would supplant riveting. Assembly lines would carve jobs into repeatable motions, borrowing habits from the auto industry. The Liberty ship would be deliberately plain, 441 feet long, a reliable triple-expansion steam engine, a British-inspired hull any General Mechanic could keep running. When German intelligence examined specifications salvaged from a torpedoed Liberty ship early in 1942, they snickered. A Corvettenkapitän named Peter Kramer called them coffins. slow, clumsy, sailing like bricks. He missed the point. Simplicity was the trick. Standardize every piece. Pre-build sections across the country. Deliver them to 18 shipyards. Assemble the ship like a puzzle the size of a block. The curve was brutal and short. Americans who had never glimpsed a dry dock learned to outpace veteran German shipwrights. The first Liberty, SS Patrick Henry, slid down on September 27, 1941, after 244 days. German analysts nodded. 50 ships a year at that clip. Manageable. But then the timeline collapsed. The second ship took 180 days. The 10th needed 105. January 1942, 70 days. Kaiser then dared the impossible, 10 days from keel to launch, and delivered. In September 1942, at Oregon Shipbuilding in Portland, while the U-boats enjoyed a second happy time, the keel for SS Joseph N. Teal went down at 12:01 a.m. on September 13th. Cranes swung 250-ton modules into place as 3 shifts moved like choreography. Wendy the welder, Janet Doyle, a former waitress, drew miles of clean weld. Alongside her, Tom Washington, an African-American recruit from Alabama, fitted steel to tolerances that matched or beat German norms. Miguel Santos, a Mexican-American, set speed records with a torch. 10 days later, at 4:30 p.m. on September 23rd, the ship hit the water. Admiral Karl Dönitz waved it away. A stunt. Unsustainable. Kaiser shrugged. Faster next time. On November 8, 1942, in Richmond, California, the keel for SS Robert E. Peary was laid in a yard that had staged every piece in advance. An entire ship, pre-assembled in the parts and stacked in order. The crew included Catherine Glasscock, a former teacher now laying 35 feet of welds per hour. Richmond Jones, an African-American crane operator, placing 250-ton blocks within an inch. Anne Mary Piloseno, 19, leading an electrical team to run 5 miles of cable in under 20 hours. Hull plates closed in 6 hours, sides up in 18. The deck house, plumbed and wired, dropped in one lift on day 2, and a 2,500 horsepower triple expansion engine, pre-tested in Toledo, seated on day 3. On November 12th at 3:30 p.m., SS Robert E. Peary went down the ways 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes after keel laying. She displaced 14,245 tons and needed only touch-up work before service. The feat that had been theatrical on paper became, in practice, routine. By December 1942, aerial photographs taken by long-range Focke-Wulf condors showed forests of Liberty holes crowding American slips. Hedman Wilhelmus counted more than 200 under construction in a single sequence and warned on December 15, 1942, that U.S. shipbuilding might be running at 10 times German estimates. The report was buried. Göring dismissed the imagery as deception, one ship staged from countless angles. U-boat skippers, staring through periscopes, sensed a different story. In January 1943, Kapitän-Leutnant Klaus Böttner of U-521 reported convoy, HX-222, with 47 merchantmen, standardized and new. Where were they coming from? From everywhere. 18 U.S. yards were producing Liberties. Bethlehem Fairfield in Baltimore, 47,000 workers, launched a ship every 4 days. California Shipbuilding delivered one every 5. The ocean had become a moving assembly line. By March 1943, 3 Liberties a day were launching, too fast for the U-boats to keep pace. Dönitz's planners crunched the math. To simply maintain pressure, the U-Bootwaffe needed to erase 1.3 million tons per month. Its best month had been November 1942, at 729,000 tons, already insufficient. Each Liberty took 250,000 distinct parts to assemble. The hull alone demanded 30,000 cuts of steel plate, 25 miles of wire, 3,100 feet of piping, 2,500 valves, and 350 miles of welding came together, and by mid-1943, the average build time was 42 days. The crews defied Nazi racial dogma. Of 650,000 shipyard workers, 200,000 were women, rosies with helmets and gloves. African Americans ran cranes and led weld teams. At the Richmond yards, integrated crews, illegal under Nazi codes, put a ship in the water every 51 hours by May 1943. Chinese-American welders worked beside Norwegian immigrants. Native American riveters teamed with Jewish refugees from Germany. Mexican-American women supervised shifts, including poor whites from Appalachia. The coalition Göring dismissed as inferior outproduced the Reich by scaling what Germany could not, a continent's diversity. May 1943, Wolfschanze, East Prussia. Donitz delivered the message Hitler dreaded. Black May had cost the U-boats 41 submarines. Only 50 merchantmen were sunk. American shipyards had launched 140 merchant vessels in a single month. "We sank 41, Donitz said. At this rate, they will replace every ship lost since 1939 by year's end." Hitler turned to Göring. "You said they could only build consumer goods." The Reichsmarshal mumbled about inferior quality, ships breaking in storms. Hitler cut him off. "Your intelligence is worthless." The reality loomed in every category. America was pushing out 8,000 aircraft a month. Germany, even with Albert Speer reorganizing, could barely reach 2,000. U.S. tank factories beat 2,000 a month. Germany eked out about 500. Liberty ships were the visible tip of a production pyramid the Reich could not match. And still, on October 4th, 1943, Göring repeated his line to the industry, the very quote that opened this narrative. 8,000 aircraft per month? Absurd, he said. And if it were true, American quality must be hopeless. Even he knew better by then. Luftwaffe pilots had met P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, and knew they were outranged, outclimbed, and outgunned. B-17s and B-24s appeared in thousand-plane streams high over Germany. The inferior airplanes were erasing cities. General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland confronted Göring afterward. American four-engine bombers, 54 a week, more than the Luftwaffe had fighters on strength. "Your dismissal has doomed the Reich," he said. Göring drifted back to Karen Hall to drown reality under stolen paintings. U-boat officers, harsher judges than any statistician, recognized American industrial might firsthand. Kapitan Lieutenant Heinz Schaefer of U-977 remembered the late 1943 convoys. 80, 90, 100 ships, most of them newly minted. "We might take one or two," he said. "It was like bailing the Atlantic with a teaspoon." Oberleutnant zur See, Herbert Werner of U-415, watched through the periscope as Liberty hulls in fresh gray slid by. Welded seams, standardized gear, silhouettes like clones. They marched in endless columns. The enemy was not a ship. It was a system that replaced losses faster than a torpedo could make them. Washington turned numbers into ammunition. By January 1944, U.S. production statistics became radioed taunts, psychological warfare. In 1943 alone, 1,038 Liberty ships, 203 faster Victory ships, 122 tankers, 367 military vessels. December 1943, 155 merchant ships launched. In that month, 8,789 aircraft delivered, 2,464 tanks, 153,000 military trucks. Wilhelm Sangen of the Reich Industry Association briefed Hitler in February 1944. The Americans were doing 100,000 aircraft to Germany's 25,000, 50,000 tanks to 19,000, 2.5 million military vehicles to 100,000, 2,500 merchant ships to 200. We cannot live with these ratios for another year. Hitler threw the paper into a fire, shouting, "Defeatist propaganda." But those figures were low. The reality of 1944 would be higher still. Tokyo did not harbor illusions. Commander Toshikazu Omi, Japanese naval attaché staff, reported to Tokyo in March 1944 that Germans were still underestimating U.S. capacity. He'd confirmed 173 ships launched in February alone. "Assume American production is double German estimates," he warned. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had said it best before Pearl Harbor. He could run wild for 6 months. Beyond that, he expected no success. He grasped what Göring never internalized. Once American industry was in gear, from an enemy's vantage point, it might as well be infinite. June 6, 1944, D-Day, made the arithmetic visible. German defenders looked out at 6,139 vessels of every size. Hundreds of Liberty ships stood ready with ammunition, fuel, vehicles. General Lieutenant Wilhelm Richter of the 716th Infantry Division wrote that the sea was black with ships. They stretched to the horizon. "This is not an invasion," he observed. "It is a migration." Each Liberty represented roughly 42 days of factory rhythm. Each Sherman tank rolling ashore was one of 88,410 produced. Every Jeep among the dunes, a tile in a mosaic of 639,245 units. Landing craft churned in from places like Evansville, Indiana, and Quincy, Illinois, built by workers who'd never seen salt water. Oberst Ernst Goth at Sword Beach remembered the party line. Americans were soft, their machines flimsy. Then he watched engineers assemble an artificial harbor in 5 days, bigger than many German ports. He saw trucks scrambling through obstacles and fighters sweeping the Luftwaffe away. The propaganda dissolved in the surf. Even in February 1945, as American bombs chewed into Berlin, Göring clung to fantasy. He muttered that production figures were exaggerated, that wooden mock-ups might be inflating counts. General der Flieger Karl Kohler, his deputy, recorded that the Reichsmarschall lived in a parallel world. 1,000 bombers had destroyed Leuna, and Göring claimed America could not possibly have built so many. When Kohler produced serials proving at least 15,000 B-17s and B-24s, Göring accused him of defeatism. The actual toll was worse for Germany's hopes. By war's end, the United States had turned out 31, 4-engine bomber types numbering 31, not just 15,000, 18,582 B-24 Liberators and 12,731 B-17 Flying Fortresses. That single class of aircraft eclipsed Germany's entire wartime aircraft production. When American forces entered the Reich Air Ministry in May 1945, they found Göring's intelligence files. Again and again, reports flagging U.S. output stamped unreliable or enemy propaganda in Göring's hand. One June 1943 memo noted 17 Liberties under construction at a Panama shipyard, visible from neutral waters, with an estimated completion rate of 1 every 3 days. Göring scrawled, "Impossible, agent compromised or insane." A December 1943 bulletin recorded the 1,000th Liberty ship. He wrote, "Propaganda, actual less than 200. Major William Hutchinson, reviewing the archives, concluded German leadership hadn't lacked data. They had rejected it because it contradicted their prejudices. At Nuremberg in 1946, prosecutors confronted Göring with hard totals: 2,710 Liberty ships, 531 Victory ships, 296,429 aircraft, 88,410 tanks, 2,383,311 military trucks. He shrugged. Quantity, not quality. Robert Jackson then produced a report by Göring's own staff from 1944 stating U.S. aircraft surpassed German models in speed, range, armament, and reliability. Göring went quiet. Later, with prison psychiatrist Dr. Gustav Gilbert, he admitted it plainly. He had believed Americans were soft, spoiled by ease. His line about consumer goods had not been a trick. It was conviction. "The greatest miscalculation of my life," he called it. They buried us under an avalanche of production. The price of that mistake was blood. Donitz kept sending boats when math said the campaign had already failed. Of 40,000 U-boat crewmen, 28,000 died, 70%. The worst casualty rate of any service branch in the war. The Luftwaffe, trusting that American aircraft output was bounded, stayed offensive too long and fed 433,000 airmen and ground crew into a grinder that replaced Germans with 50 American aircraft for each German plane. Germany built 1,162 U-boats and sank nearly 3,000 Allied ships, 175 warships, and 2,125 merchantmen, but the Allies built 5,627 merchant ships. For every ship that went under, 2 more appeared. Equations don't care about ideology. Behind the steel and steam stood a human ocean. 18 million Americans in war production, more workers than the Reich fielded in uniform. The Richmond complex alone counted 93,000 people, greater than Germany's entire shipbuilding workforce. Their stories broke every Nazi talking point. Emma Martinez, a Mexican-American at Todd Houston Shipbuilding, laid 300 feet of clean welds per shift. Dorothy Luck, once a homemaker in Oakland, ran a crane lifting 250-ton modules. Thomas Washington, the Alabama sharecropper turned shipfitter, hit precision marks German inspectors would have applauded. Yards operated with integrated cafeterias despite local segregation. Child care centers let mothers work full shifts. Clinics treated injuries. Overtime came with pay and pride. Workers made around what means 20 per hour, a day's wages for many skilled Germans, and bought war bonds with what they didn't need at home. The Reich, short on loyal hands, leaned into forced labor from conquered lands, men and women who slowed work or sabotaged it when they could. American teenagers stayed in school. German teenagers stood behind flak guns. Liberty ships became rolling showcases for innovations Germany didn't scale. Welding shed weight, roughly 600 tons per ship, and shaved time by about 30%. Lincoln Electric's welding methods shocked German engineers who had called such precision impossible until they saw it. Prefab went deeper in the U.S. than in Germany. Deck houses, complete with plumbing, wiring, even furniture, were built miles from the slip and then hoisted into place by cranes with 250-ton lifts, 5 times the capability of the Reich's biggest yard cranes. Kaiser's real breakthrough was not a new tool, but a system. Specialization. A welder running the same joint until it was muscle memory. An electrician threading standard harnesses at speed. The learning curve steepened like a cliff. By December, newcomers who had never set foot on a pier in July outperformed European veterans. The logistics that fed all this would have looked like fantasy to German planners. Steel from Pittsburgh arrived when the slips needed it, not earlier, not later. Engines came from Toledo, pre-tested. Generators from Schenectady appeared on schedule. The Pennsylvania Railroad alone hauled 50 million tons of war materials in 1943, more than Germany's entire rail system at times, and America did it while still running passenger trains. Major Hans Karl, a German logistics officer who studied U.S. methods after the war, wrote that the Reich struggled to supply a single factory. The Americans supplied entire sectors, counted trains instead of cars, and planned in years instead of weeks. Even as liberties poured out, the United States upped the design. The Victory ships of 1944 were quicker, 15 to 17 knots instead of 11, bigger, more capable, yet nearly as fast to build at 42 days on average. They got turbine engines, sleeker hulls, better ventilation to save cargo, improved navigation gear, all slotted into production without slowing it. In contrast, Germany's attempt to leap ahead with the Type Wunderweit U-boat tripped over itself. Only 4 boats were operational before surrender. America finished 531 Victory ships in a year and a half. The macroeconomy told the same story from higher altitude. In 1941, American GDP stood at $126 billion, Germany's at roughly $35 billion. U.S. steel, 80 million tons versus 20 million. Electricity production, 26 billion kilowatt hours versus 8 billion. American output surged 170% during the war. Germany's climbed about 30% despite Speer's triage. By 1944, the United States was spending $90 billion a year on the war, more than Germany's entire pre-war economy. The Liberty program alone ran $4.6 billion, exceeding the cost of Germany's entire U-boat fleet effort. Dr. Ralph Wagenfuhr, who kept the Reich's wartime books, later calculated the ratios. America outproduced Germany 6-1 in raw materials, 8-1 in finished goods, 12-1 in transport. We were not defeated, he wrote. We were buried. Propagandists in Washington made the numbers part of the fight. A ship every 8 hours, a plane every 5 minutes, a tank every 7. The phrases sounded like boasting, until soldiers saw them made real. Grenadier Helmut Rommelmann in Normandy admitted that when the Americans announced 10,000 planes for the invasion, he laughed, until the sky turned into a ceiling of wing after wing. What Berlin called propaganda matched reality. What the Reich called truth fell apart under it. Liberty ships also reshaped the society that built them. Integrated yards, while still constrained by local prejudice, modeled a post-war America where the civil rights fight could point to wartime proof. Women who ran torches, cranes, and shifts never unproved their capability. The workforce after 1945 could not pretend they hadn't done it. Kaiser's wartime health program for workers later evolved into Kaiser Permanente, caring today for 12 million. Welding and prefabrication became global standards. Post-war shipbuilding in Japan and Korea, destined to lead the world, borrowed heavily from American wartime techniques. The broader moral, democracies, given a chance, mobilize better than tyrannies. Free people outperform forced labor. Diversity produces the resilience and scale single ideology states struggle to summon. At Nuremberg, facing judgment, Göring tried to keep his aristocratic posture, but avoided the subject of American production. On October 15, 1946, 2 hours before his appointed execution, he took cyanide. Dr. Gustav Gilbert recorded a final confession about what Göring misjudged. A nation that could raise the empire's state building in 410 days could do anything. He had believed Germany's line about American decadence and paid with a war. The ugly ducklings, he admitted, should have been called victory ships from the first. They were Germany's defeat made tangible. 2 of them still live at sea today. The SS John W. Brown and SS Jeremiah O'Brien, last operable witnesses of the greatest industrial run in history. When they steam past the Statue of Liberty on memorial voyages, their horns carry across the same waters once haunted by U-boats, a reminder of a time when democracy was tested by men who mistook kindness for weakness. Commander Edward Ellsberg, the salvage master at Normandy, captured their essence. They were plain, slow, simple, and everywhere. They carried Shermans and candy bars, ammo and plasma. They were the bridge between assembly lines and assault beaches. Göring said Americans could only turn out consumer goods. In the end, Americans turned out everything, including victory. The 2007-10 liberties are more than tonnage tallies. They're warnings about the price of contempt. The people Göring labeled soft built a war economy that made generalship almost secondary. They proved wars can be decided on factory floors as decisively as on ridgelines, and that anyone who bets against a free nation's capacity to build, to learn, to adapt, to out-organize, does so at existential risk. October 4th, 1943, in Berlin began with a line that sounded confident and ended as a confession to history. The arithmetic that Göring ignored, Liberty ships launched in tens, then hundreds, then thousands, aircraft in the hundreds of thousands, tanks and trucks by the millions, wrote the end of the Reich more surely than any single battle. Those oak-paneled walls in the Air Ministry heard a boast masquerading as analysis. Outside, assembly lines were already answering, hour by hour, with steel and steam.